Somebody asked me this morning how I was doing, and I said, I'm a little tired. I'm so tired I forgot that I had turned on the recording, so I had to check. Today's verse. I need to give you a little awareness. One of the things I do when I start working on a book is I get 3 commentators from different sources so that I make sure that if I find something in the verse that's not in any of them, I don't bring it here because it's probably not in there. But also in this verse, in what we're going to talk about today, I have 3 commentators and they all have 3 different takes on the verse. And as I read their takes, what I read is their theology interpreting the Bible, not the other way around. Do you understand what I'm saying? They have a belief that this means that, and whenever it does that, they then write about that, what they already believed, rather than reading the text and telling us what it says. So I'm going to avoid some of those because we're in Mark 13, and half of the end times people use it one way, and half of the rest of the church says, no, that's not what it means. So let's talk about that a little bit. Have you ever heard Psalm 20 when it talks? Do you know what it says? It says, some will trust in horses and some will trust in chariots, but we will trust in the name of our God. Do you know what that comes from? Do you know what the story that comes from? That comes from Egypt going into the Red Sea, and Miriam comes out in Exodus 13 and says, the horse and riders fell into the sea. Look at all the trust they put in the wrong places. And you can go through the Bible in all sorts of places. In the Deborah story in Judges, they're having a problem with the king of Syria because he's got iron chariots. And they can't beat them because they have bronze weapons. Do you understand what happens to a bronze sword when you hit it with an iron sword? The bronze sword bends and breaks and it's useless. But there's this issue in the Deborah story that the iron chariots are very heavy. And so what God does is he rains on the field of battle for 2 days. And then your heavy chariots, what will they do you then? Because they just get stuck. They're going to stick in the mud. Which brings to me Psalm 40 to mind, right? Here I am in the muck and the mire. Who will rescue me? He lifts me out of the muck and the mire and sets my feet upon the rock. Who do we trust in? Do we trust in the rock? Or the chariots that get us in the muck and the mire? Or who did they trust in the story that Roxanne read this morning? They went in and they said, before we follow God, let's send some scouts in and determine the best way to follow God. What's the best way to follow God?
Just to follow him.
To do what he says, and soon, right? I met a guy at annual conference once that thinks he's called into ministry, but he's waiting until his bank account gets a certain size, and so he's telling me about this, and I said, so you told him no? He goes, no, I've said I'm waiting. Yeah, you said no. That's what that means. He will take care of those details if you do that. I'm telling you this story because the Israelites thought that the descendants of Anak were too powerful and they didn't trust in the power of the Lord, which is the same mistake as trusting in your own power and not his power. It's just in the opposite direction. I just need to say this as I get ready to read this. Let's read from Mark 13. That is page 1561. 1561 in your Bible, in your Pew Bible. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of the disciples said, "Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones in the walls." And you should know that that they're going out to the Mount of Olives. They're leaving the Temple Mount, and they're going out to Mount of Olives. And do you know what you can see from the Mount of Olives? The temple. It's like being next to the biggest building you've ever seen, and that's all you can see. It dominates the skyline. Yes, Jesus replied, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. It's actually not exactly the way the Greek does it. The Greek is, every one of these will be toppled from where it stands, from its strength. Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives across from the valley of the temple, and Peter, James, and John, and Andrew came to him privately and asked, tell us when all this will happen. What sign will show us that these things are about to happen and be fulfilled? So Jesus starts telling them, don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am Messiah, and they will deceive many, and you will hear of wars and threats of wars. But don't panic. These things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war, kingdoms against kingdoms. There will be earthquakes in many parts of the world, and famines, but these are just first birth pains. When these things begin to happen, watch out. You'll be handed over to local councils and beaten in the synagogues, and you will stand trial before governors and kings because of you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell them about me, for the good news must first be preached to all nations. But when you are arrested and stand trial, don't worry in advance about what to say. Okay, so he's still answering their question, which is straightforward. When are these rocks going to be unsettled? When's the temple going to be torn up? That's what he's doing. So I have a question for you. Do you know the history of AD 70? That's when Jerusalem was demolished for the umpteenth time. Just on a side note, I was doing genealogy stuff once, and somebody came to me and they said, my whole family, we trace our genealogy through Jerusalem. And she was telling me this in front of my mom, and my mom looks at her and she goes, wow. Because, Jerusalem's been rubble 14 times in history. How do you have any records when it's rubble? It doesn't happen. When you trust in genealogy, Jerusalem cannot be your center. You understand what I mean? When you trust in genealogy, you can't have a place be your repository that doesn't get to live for very long before it gets destroyed over and over and over again. Anyway, he's answering the question. A brother will betray his brother to death. A father will betray his own child. Children will rebel against their parents and cause them to be killed. By the way, that's one of the 4 commandments that the midrashes and the rabbis spend so much time on, that children are disobeying their parents. It's so important to them that they actually believe that they got conquered by Assyria and Babylon and by Rome because they didn't honor their parents right. Because the promise is, if you honor your parents, you will live long in the land. They don't get to keep the land, so what's the one promise that has a command that has a promise? That one. And so here it is. This will be going on. And everyone will hate you because you are my followers, but the one who endures will be saved to the end. This day is coming when you'll see the sacrilegious object of desecration. That's the abomination of desecration. And there's a whole history around that language. Okay? It's not just Daniel. It's not just Maccabees. It's not just Revelation. Just trust me when I say, when false worship starts to happen in the center of the place of worship, God says, no, we're not doing this anymore. And he disrupts the buildings and everything in them. It's not just the abomination of desolation. It's not just the sacrifice of a pig in the Jewish temple, which was bad by by the God manifested one. That's what his name means. Antiochus Epiphanes. His name means the God manifested one. Now you could make a case that Antiochus Epiphanes sacrifices a pig in the temple because that's what pagans do. They sacrifice pigs in temples. He doesn't know how, he might not even know how offensive. Now, when you read the stories, he does know. But you could make a case that he's just doing what he's supposed to be doing. But the abomination of desolation, the worship that causes desolation, is to not trust in the Lord in truth and spirit, as Jesus says in John 4 when he talks to the woman at the well. It's not John 4, that's the wrong reference. Anyway, when he talks to the woman at the well, she says to him, your people say that you have to worship in Jerusalem, and my people say that you have to do this. And he goes, well, the time's coming when you have to worship in spirit and in truth. That neither place has it right. That the problem with saying we have to worship in Jerusalem is what happens if Jerusalem is not supposed to be the center of worship because it's corrupted. What do the Maccabees do in 1 Maccabees after the temple is desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes? They try to cleanse it. What does Jesus do after his triumphal entry is turned aside by the leaders of Jerusalem? He tries to cleanse it. What's to be done in your understanding with a temple that tries to get cleansed but doesn't respond right? Say that again. It's taken down. Why is it taken down? Because it's corrupt. Actually, because it disobeyed God. I had Roxanne read this story. Why does a generation go into the desert to be destroyed? Not because there's giants in the land, but because they disobeyed God. Well, we've sinned and we'll go obey him now. And he said, yeah, sorry. No. Now I want to say that if I keep reading this, some of you are going to say that this is end time stuff, and some of you are going to say that this is destruction of Jerusalem stuff. Okay? And your theology and the way you've been taught says one of those two things. Yes? Because it says this generation will pass away, the day is coming. I have a question to ask you. Is the destruction of Jerusalem the great and terrible day of the Lord? Because we're still here, right? Now, is it the great day of judgment for Jerusalem? Yeah, it is. And why does Jerusalem need a great day of judgment? Because they have disobeyed God, and they refused the cleansing when he offered it. Why did the people of the Old Testament not get to come into the promised land? Because they refused the word of the Lord when it was offered. They equivocated. They asked questions. They made plans. They started to do stuff. They said, well, I can't do it until I have enough money to do it. Our chariots, we don't have a big enough army yet. We need to wait a generation and raise a bigger army. Well, the people are too strong for you, but not for God. And so they go off, and this generation will not pass away before the judgment happens. That's the Old Testament thing. I'm here to tell you that God is utterly trustworthy to be the same God all the time. Now, sometimes that means that he's unchanging and implacable. I don't think that's what the language of the Bible is ever saying, because you can make a case now that there's scars in heaven. God has scars. And that would be a change, yes? But the scars he takes are a symbol that his character has remained utterly the same. and unchangeable. He was always going to take the hit for the obedient people, the ones that would respond. Does that make sense to you? That when he says do and you do, he was always going to provide a way for you, even if you can't see it. What Pastor Sean from the assembly said to me, one of the things his mom used to say, and I think I said this last week, just because you don't like the choices doesn't mean you don't have any. But you say, God says do this. Well, I don't like it. It's still a choice, right? I set before you a choice of life and death. Oh, that you would choose life. What is the choice of life when God asks you to do something? Yes, thank you. I will gratefully do that. That is the choice of life. What is the choice of death? No, not yet. I don't, I'm not going to talk to Bob or Sally about Jesus today, even though you put it on my mind to do that. I don't like the situation. It's not comfortable. I might not say the right things. I might say a stupid thing. Can I remove all doubt? You're gonna. It's okay. If God's asking you to do it, he's asking for that comment, whatever you're going to make. Life is in the obedience. What's happening in Mark 13? Well, something really profound is about to happen, and it requires me to tell a little bit of a story, right? Back to the cleansing of the temple. Jesus is trying to cleanse the temple for one reason. Why is that? So worship can happen there. Right? When he cleanses the temple, so worship can happen there, and they come up and they say, by what authority you're doing these things, because you need to knock it off, you're messing with us. I mean, they don't use those words, but that's what they're saying. We're making money here in the court of the Gentiles, and we don't care if the Gentiles come to pray. They don't need a place. That's what they're saying. We need this place for us to make money. Because that's what the priest said. Did you know that to pay the temple tax, you had to pay with a certain coin? And if you didn't have that coin, you had to go to the money changers and take your money and buy the correct coin at their rate. Karen had do you have that envelope for a second? I'm going to steal part of your children's church moment. I was counting on it. Yeah, I'm just going to use this one, which wasn't part of your plan. So this is super cool. You see this? This is a Brazilian Dois Real. No. Dois Reals. Do you know what that's worth on exchange?
Probably $2.
Probably 46 cents-ish. Right? It might be 46 cents. It might be less now. It's been 2 years since I faced exchange rate. But when you go to the airport and you get exchange rate, you don't get a good rate, right? Because they're the first place you're going to need money. That's what the temple was doing. If you wait into town and you know somebody in town and you have American money, they'll give you a good rate for your American money, and they want to save your American money because that appreciates in their society faster than any bank interest. So later on, they could take your 100, which they give you a bunch of these for so you could buy stuff in town, and get a lot more reals for them because they waited and the exchange rate changed. But they were doing that. And then you had to sacrifice a lamb, but they had to approve the lamb. And, most of the lambs you brought in weren't right. So you would have to sell your lamb because it wasn't right and buy another lamb that was right at a higher rate. And, you're coming from across the Greek world, your lamb, you can't really travel with the lamb in a little box to protect it for for 17 days. That's not how that works. But they were doing that, and it was destroying the worship because worship was corrupted. And so he tries to cleanse it. Now I'm going to ask you to use your imagination. At the Last Supper, in the book of John, what does Jesus do with his disciples first in the room? Washes their feet. And he has this discussion about cleansing with Peter, doesn't he? If you've been cleansed a little, you just need to be cleansed here. But if you don't let me do this, you can have no part of me. Why is he doing that other than making sure their feet don't smell?
Probably make sure they're still bonded with him.
Making sure that they're still bonded with him. But you know, he washes Judas's feet. So Judas didn't stay bonded with him, did it? But Judas was going to be disobedient. So even if you're cleansed and you decide to be disobedient, what happens to the stones of the temple, of a disobedient temple? They are upset and turned off on edge and destroyed, yes? The problem is that God never asked for a temple built with human hands. He was always after a temple, a place of worship that he made. And it was always going to be the hearts of the people. And so he cleanses them so they can be temples. Just like he cleansed the people coming out of Egypt through the Red Sea in a baptism of sorts, and the next generation that didn't say no to going in, they got to go through the Jordan in the same way, ready to become the people of God. We do that with baptism now. But what about obedience? Is Christianity a one-time decision that you never have to do anything about again later? No. And when you hear people say that, you think, I was thinking, oh, the poverty of that choice, right? You have such a poor understanding that you do that. But what happens is if you don't start being in obedience, you start being in disobedience. And disobedient temples get what? Torn down. That's what this is about. I could go into end time stuff if you want. I just don't think this is talking about it. Because what he says is, this generation on this day, and he's talking about a temple specific and answering a question. Now, I could be wrong, because I've been wrong several times. I heard just the other day that somebody liked it on YouTube because she could correct me. Isn't that what I heard, Mary? What did I say? If you're going to correct me, raise your hand in the service so we can do it together. I just want you to know this thing. What do we do with this? Not a single stone will remain on this disobedient temple. Verse, what do we do with that kind of language in Jesus? He's utterly trustworthy. Utterly and completely trustworthy that if the temple that he's purified will not worship him, it'll get upset. Now, some of you might say, well, I've worshipped him and I've tried to do that, and it feels like my building stones are being torn from one too. Yeah, the parts of your building that weren't there by his hand are getting removed, and new ones are being taken in, right? So I had lots of things I thought that I was doing super good when I first came to Jesus, and almost none of them get to stay. Is that your Christian experience? Yeah, okay, so I see some yeses. There's some yeses in the room. Is it fun to have yourself cleansed over and over again, waiting on your obedience in Jesus? No. Is it worth it? Yes. And so I'm going to borrow a statement I made yesterday in the funeral message, okay? In some world, the word saint has got misconstrued into a person who does miracles. But that's not what the Bible thinks about saint. You know what the Bible thinks about saint? That without God's help, you'd have better luck fitting through the eye of a needle. You're the miracle. When you believe in Him and get new life, you're a saint, a miracle. You just did something that was not possible without God. What do we do? I'm going to ask you to obey. That He'll cleanse and He'll work in the little corners. He's like a good house cleaner, right, that works in the areas you're not noticing because those areas get worse if you don't clean them. And He keeps going, and He's so trustworthy that He will remove your areas of disobedience if you'll let Him. But if you won't, you will start to say to Him, well, I'd kind of like to have life in you, but I don't want to be obedient here. And that's not going to work out for you. There's going to come a time where this is what we should do. The coming of the Son of Man, this is the end of, can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. When he left home, he gave each of his slaves instructions about the work they were to do, and he told the gatekeeper to watch for his return. You too must keep watch, for you don't know when the master of the house will return. In the evening, at midnight, before dawn, at daybreak, don't let him find you sleeping when he arrives without warning. I say to you what I say to everyone. Watch for him. Does that mean you don't get to go to sleep? No, it means don't be disobedient in those moments when you don't think he's coming. That's asleep in this case. Yes? How do we deal with that? Listen carefully. Get used to hearing his voice. Say yes to him a lot. And I know you might say, well, I said yes to him a lot, and I'm kind of tired of it. You're not done yet. He will give you the energy. His mercies are new every morning. Yeah? Thank you for not making me do the end time stuff, because I don't think it's in here, but this is how we prepare. We look not at the big stones, but at the Lord. Yeah? Let's do that in our life. Say that again. The Lord is way above the big stone. You're correct. Or in Psalm 40, he's the one that lifts me out of the muck and the mire and sets my feet on top of the rock. I think I've had enough. Let's pray. Oh Lord, you are a strong tower, and the righteous run into you, and when they do, they're saved. Help us be saved. Help us continue to work out our salvation with fear and trembling by saying yes to you and modifying our lives as we go. Because in you is life and breath and hope. We thank you, Lord Jesus, for your gift of salvation. Amen.